Today's video is going to be another squishy makeover. I'm gonna try and do them once a month, but I'm not sure how well I'll be able to stick to that, but I'll try. This one I did by myself. There's no special appearances or anything like that this time. But I hope you still enjoy it, and I don't have anything else to say, so let's just get into it. The first squishy I'll be making over is this sad, neglected donut. I'm starting out with removing the little plastic keychain attachment piece and then filling the hole it left behind with some puffy paint. Now I'm trying to peel the frosting drizzle off the donut, and it was a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. I thought it would all just peel up in one piece, but I had to go and pick at it with my fingernails until eventually I gave up and used a sanding block. And even then, it didn't come off entirely, so this was a very lengthy process. By the time I was done, I had somehow squeezed all of the puffy paint out of the hole, so I had to go back and refill that. Finally, I could begin the painting of the base coats. I heard that using a combination of slick and matte puffy paint would make it easier so you'd need less coats, but that was not the case for me. I found that I needed a lot more using the matte paint, so eventually I gave up on that method and just went back to my regular white puffy paint, which did still require quite a few coats, but at least it was actually showing up this time. I'm not sure why in this squishy makeover my hands got so messy. I really don't remember them getting covered with paint the last time I did a squishy makeover, but somehow this happened, so I'm sorry if it's distracting. When the white base coat was finally opaque enough, I started painting on the actual colors. So with the color, I know that it looks like I'm trying to go for a chocolate donut, but this is actually supposed to be a brownie, just in the shape of a donut. I'm sure at times I will slip up and refer to it as a donut, but I am deciding that it is a brownie donut. I seem to have misplaced my paint palette, so for a palette in this video, I'm going to be using a canvas that still has the plastic wrap around it. Anyway, after I had the chocolate coat done, I then moved on to the frosting colors. I wanted to go with a pastel rainbow theme for the frosting, so that's what I attempted to do. I also had to try and blend paint for the first time, and that was pretty nerve-wracking. I'm sure a lot of people like to mix up all of the colors and then paint, but I didn't want to risk the paint drying up while I was putting the coat on, as silly as that might sound, so that's why I did every color individually. I also only had fluorescent orange, so that was kind of hard to make a pastel out of, but it worked out. What didn't work out as smoothly was trying to blend the colors. I'm not really sure how people do this, especially Moriah Elizabeth, because her paint blending seems to be flawless. So I pretty much just figured out a good way to do it that worked for me through trial and error, and it was very time-consuming and frustrating, and there were times where I messed up badly and had to go back and redo it, and it was very frustrating. I think in the end it somewhat paid off. It wasn't a perfect job, but for my first time trying this, it's not that bad. I basically just added on a stripe of the color, and then I used the brush to drag the previous color into the current color, and then I also dragged the current color into the previous color, if that makes any sense. I don't often work with pastel colors, so I was kind of new with mixing those as well, but I think I did okay. It's really not that hard, you just need more white than the actual color, as far as I know anyway. At this point, it was starting to resemble rainbow sherbet ice cream, and I thought about going with that for a theme instead, but ultimately I decided to stick to my rainbow pastel theme. The green was a little tricky because it was also a fluorescent color like the orange was, and I was really scared to go overboard and make it too dark since green is a darker color than the rest of the previous ones I had used, so I ended up making it too light, and then I had to go back and make it darker. I was also really struggling with blending the green and the yellow together because one overpowered the other, and at one point there was practically no yellow, and at another point there was practically no green, and it was a big disaster. And for whatever reason, brilliant me thought that would be a good time to mess with the blending of the other colors too, so then I had to go and fix all of that. Despite all of that, the blending was looking pretty good, at least it was holding up to my standards for myself, so I continued on and went to blue. I pretty much had the same problem with blue and green that I did with yellow and green. I was blending them into each other too much to the point where one of the colors would disappear, so it was pretty much the last three colors that gave me the most problems. From what I've gathered, you're supposed to blend the wet paint with a dry brush. I believe that helps make it look more neat, but I really didn't notice a difference with whether or not my brush was wet or dry. So if anybody has any advice for paint blending, I would greatly appreciate it. When I was done adding on the last color, I went around the edges and brought some of the color down over the edge of the donut, so that way it looked more like frosting dripping. Then, for some stupid reason, I dragged my paintbrush across the surface of the donut in an attempt to blend the colors together more, and that miserably failed. Thankfully, I mostly was able to just wipe the streaks off. Then I went around and neatened up the brown to really emphasize the dripping frosting, and I'm really glad that I did this step because I think this is what made it all come together nicely. And finally, here's the before and after. I know I didn't do a fantastic job with blending the paint, especially because it was my first time attempting to do so, but I think it is a vast improvement from the sad, neglected donut that it was before. Also, the combination of the chocolate and the rainbow reminded me of a cosmic brownie, so I'm calling this a cosmic donut. It's still a brownie donut, though. For our next makeover, we have this mermaid that I got at the Dollar Tree. I was so excited when my local Dollar Tree finally started carrying squishies, so I bought one of every single design they had. Don't judge me. Her seams were really bothering me, so it was time to bring out the scissors. I'm aware these things are filthy. I cut a lot of adhesive stuff with them. I started off by cutting off the tag, and then I had to get the plastic bit out of her using my teeth. I'm not proud of that. And then I began cutting off her enormous seams. Things were going well until I accidentally gave her a bald spot. It wasn't too big of a deal though, since we would be painting over it anyway. It was mostly the seams on her tail that were bothering me, as well as along the side of her arms, so that's what I was mostly focused on. I also proceeded to give her a few more bald spots because I'm a horrible person. For what it's worth, it was accidental, and it would all be worth it in the end. Once her seams were as trimmed down as I could get them, I began to sand her. I personally don't find this step necessary because the squishies that I made last time I didn't sand and the paint is sticking on them just fine, but I just did it to do it properly and take precautions. Then I proceeded to give her several white base coats. For some reason I only did it on the front. I really should have done it on the back too, and I will suffer for that later. I was very short on time and impatient, so I took out the blow dryer. And it was around 9:30 or 10 at night, so I'm sure my neighbors loved me. When the base coats were finally dry, I began mixing a skin color for her. This did not end up being as simple as I thought it would be. I thought I'd just need some white and some brown and a tiny bit of red for blush and pigment, and some cat hair apparently. But it did not come together the way I expected it to, and adding yellow to it was not a good decision. So I added a bunch more white, and I was pretty much back at square one. Thankfully, after a few more adjustments, I was able to get the skin tone I wanted, so I started to apply it to her. I figured it would be best to start with the skin so that way when I was painting on the cosmetic details and stuff, if it went over the skin it would be okay. Whereas if I got the skin color on the cosmetic details, it would probably prove more difficult, and you'll see why in just a minute. The bright side to the skin color being so difficult to mix was that I ended up with a lot of extra paint, so that way I knew I had plenty of coverage in case I made a mistake. And I had plenty to cover both sides of her body with. It would be nice if I could find some skin colors of puffy paint though. That would make my life a lot easier and save me on a lot of paint. So if that exists, please let me know because I haven't seen any anywhere. So it was really late at night by now. I spent about 3 hours on this squishy, so I was practically exhausted, and I was also a nervous wreck because I had a very clear vision of what I wanted for this squishy in my mind, and I could not mess it up. Not to mention, I'm working with paint, which dries, so time was of the essence. When I was finally done giving her skin, it was time to move on to the tail, which I was very excited for, but I was also very terrified for. I've mentioned a few times in the past that I really like the look of galaxies, so I decided to give her a galaxy-themed tail. I mostly just used the method that I use when I paint galaxies on canvas. I just get a bunch of different blues and purples. In this case, I only had one shade of each, and then I just tried to swirl those together nicely. But unfortunately, I wanted to thin out the paint so it wouldn't be all lumpy, and that ended up just mixing it into a bluish purple, so I had to try and go back and add some more blue and purple more separately and not swirl them together as much. This was kind of a blessing in disguise though, because now I had a background color so it would be more opaque. And this time I added in some neon pink, which made it look really nice as well. While the paint was still wet, I sprinkled on some white glitter to look like stars. I knew it probably wouldn't stay, but I thought it would look cool. I did the same thing to the back side of the tail, I just didn't put any glitter on that side. Once the tail was finished, I went around and neatened up any flaws with some more of the skin color. And even though I was using the blow dryer, I was still so nervous about contaminating other parts of the squishy with wet paint because I just did not want to ruin this. I had already put so much time and work into it, and I would be devastated if something were to happen. When I was done neatening up the skin details, I went ahead and started to paint the galaxy theme on her top as well. Being that this was a much smaller surface area, I wasn't quite as nervous about it, but I was still kind of nervous about getting some of the purple on her skin, or just ruining the shape of her top. I went around and I painted the back of her top as well, but I didn't put as much effort into that since obviously the focus of the squishy was going to be the front. Once again, I added some glitter while the paint was still wet to look like stars. Then I went around with the skin color and neatened up the edges of her top as well as covered up any purple paint that I got on her arms. I also turned her over and fixed any flaws on the back as well. The next detail I had to focus on was her hair. With the help of my boyfriend, we decided on teal. As I mentioned earlier, I don't have any teal puffy paint, so I just had to mix blue, white, and green and hope for the best. I was being really stingy with the teal color because I didn't mix a whole lot of it, and when you mix paint a second time, it's never the same exact color as the first, so I just had to do my best to make as much as I could go as far as I could. This is where I really started regretting not painting the backside white as well, because this color was nowhere near opaque enough to cover the pink of her hair. Also, when I turned her over, I noticed a huge splotch of purple somehow got on her face. Thankfully, I was able to peel it off pretty easily and it didn't leave a stain. But like I said, it was late at night and I had to go as quickly as I could, and I was working with a limited color for her hair, so everything that was tiny was really a huge deal to me in this moment, and I was so overwhelmed. I just had to keep hoping that the end result would be worth all of the struggle. So originally, with the hair, I wanted to cut off her little ponytail things and glue them to the top of her head so they'd look like space buns. You know, since she's a galactic mermaid, I thought it would be appropriate, but I decided not to mess with that because I don't have that skill level quite yet. By the time I was done with her hair, I thankfully had made just enough teal to make it opaque in the front. I might need to go over the back at another time, but I was happy with the front, so I was going to move on to the face. For the face, I wanted to give it a Funko Pop type expression because the shape of the head was just giving me Funko Pop vibes, so that's what I attempted to do. By now, my skin color was mostly dry, so I could not mess this up, so this was probably the most horrifying part for me. And what do you know, I messed up the eye placement, the eyelashes were crooked, and I gave her a mouth that I ended up hating, so I had to use what little bit of wet skin color paint I had left to try and fix that. I got it covered for the most part, and then I tried to give her an eye again, and this time it looked like she was winking when I started to make it, so I thought about keeping that as her expression, but ultimately I went with the original one instead. I also noticed I somehow got some black paint on her hair, but I didn't have any teal left to cover it up, and I was so close to being finished, so I just tried my best to ignore it. Using the rest of the wet skin color paint, I tried to even out her eyes and make them look more symmetrical, and eventually I got to where it was good enough for me, so the squishy was complete. Honestly, I am so proud of this. I cannot believe the transformation. I'm so in love with it. This galactic mermaid is probably one of my most favorite creations I've ever made. I'm having trouble coming up with a name for her, so let me know if you have any ideas. But I seriously cannot get over how much I love her. Moving on to the last squishy for this video is this ice cream cone. I've known I wanted to do a watermelon themed squishy for this makeover, and originally I was going to use a little bunny and turn it into a popsicle, but looking at the bunny's face just made me feel guilty, so I couldn't go through with it, so instead I went with the ice cream cone. I started out by painting the ice cream swirl red. I had to do a few coats because the red wasn't as opaque as I thought it was, and as you probably saw, I didn't do the white base coat, but it wasn't a huge deal. Next, I trimmed down some of the seams. I really should have done that first. I'm not sure why I didn't, but here we are. Next, I'm mixing up a light green color to be the rind of the watermelon. Since I'm working with an ice cream cone and not an actual watermelon with a rind, I decided to give the pattern of the rind to the cone. Honestly, I thought this was a really neat and clever idea, and I really liked how it was coming along when I started painting the cone green. By the way, the lighting in here is really bad, so the ice cream looks more pink than it does red, but I assure you it is red. Once the cone had all of its base coats, I took some dark green and started adding some stripes. I think this really emphasized the watermelon theme because the rinds have these stripes, and I feel like they're just a very significant detail for some reason. That probably sounds weird, but that's just how I feel. When I was done painting the cone, I went around and neatened up the edges, as well as added some more green to the rim of the cone because for some reason I painted red over that instead. Also, somehow I got a bunch of dark green paint on the ice cream portion of the squishy, so I had to go back and cover that up as well. After the excessive amounts of touch-up work, I could finally move on to the next step, which was adding the seeds. I feel kind of cheated because this part was not as satisfying as I had hoped for it to be, but I think that's because my paintbrush I was using was starting to fall apart and fray, so that made it very difficult. It was still visually satisfying though, because I think this detail, along with the rind stripes, really made it all come together. Here's the before and after. Originally, I think it was supposed to be some type of cotton candy vanilla twist, and I can appreciate that, but I really like how I transformed it. I think it was a clever idea, and I just think it looks really cool. It's fun to look at. Here are all 3 of the squishies I did in this video. My favorite is definitely the Galactic Mermaid. Let me know in the comments which one is your favorite. I'll see you all next time. Bye!